Imagine that all of a sudden, you discover that the fear that has accompanied you for years was never real in the way you thought. I'm not talking about a psychological trick or an empty positive thought, but something much deeper, something that completely changes the way you see your own existence. Think for a moment. How many times have you felt anguish, anxiety, or even despair over something that, in the end, wasn't as serious as it seemed? How many nights have you lost, unable to sleep, ruminating over catastrophic scenarios that never happened? Or worse, how many times have you felt paralyzed, incapable of acting, because your mind convinced you that something terrible would happen if you made that decision? Fear is a constant presence in most people's lives. It paralyzes, suffocates, makes you doubt yourself, and prevents you from living freely. But what if fear wasn't really your enemy? What if, in fact, it was a messenger, trying to show you something you insist on ignoring? This might seem like a strange idea at first, but Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychologists in history, understood it like no one else. For Jung, fear was not just a fleeting emotion, but a key to understanding hidden parts of ourselves, parts we avoid, reject, and bury deep in our unconscious. But what happens when we deny these parts? Fear grows. It transforms into an internal monster, sabotaging our choices, our relationships, and our very identity. And the scariest part? We do this without even realizing it. Fear governs us because we don't know where it comes from. We remain trapped in destructive behavior patterns because we don't understand that much of what we feel doesn't stem from the present, but from past experiences that were never fully understood. Jung called this the shadow, everything we deny in ourselves, everything we reject and hide, but which continues to exist, operating in the depths of our psyche, silently dictating our reactions and fears. You may have never thought of it this way, but how many times have you felt afraid of rejection, of failure, of being criticized, of not being good enough? And what if I told you that these fears are not truly yours, but rather a reflection of something you absorbed throughout life? Old experiences, silent traumas, inherited patterns that you never questioned. Jung discovered that what we avoid confronting becomes precisely what controls us. If fear is a reflection of the hidden parts of ourselves, the question that arises is, how did it all begin? How did we reach a point where our own emotions imprison us? For Jung, it all originates in the way we deal with our psyche from childhood. From an early age, we learn that some emotions and behaviors are acceptable, while others are reprimanded. A child who cries too much may be told they need to be strong. A boy who shows sensitivity may be ridiculed. A girl who expresses herself intensely may be labeled as dramatic. And so, without realizing it, we begin to hide essential parts of who we are. We store all of this in a dark corner of our mind, believing we will never have to deal with these feelings again. But they don't disappear. What Jung discovered is that all these emotions, fears, and unaccepted impulses form what he called the shadow. The shadow is the part of us that we try to hide, but which continues to silently influence our thoughts, emotions, and decisions. And the fear we feel often doesn't come from the present. It comes from our inability to look at this shadow and understand it. The irony is that the more we try to ignore these repressed parts, the more powerful they become. They manifest in unexpected ways, in unexplained anxiety, in anger that erupts at inopportune moments, in procrastination that prevents us from taking action, in the constant fear of others' judgment. Jung realized that everything we try to repress eventually controls us. And this explains why so many people live as prisoners of their fears without even understanding where they come from. Maybe you've experienced this before, that feeling of wanting to try something new but sensing an invisible block holding you back. The desire to express yourself freely, but an inner voice whispering that you will be ridiculed. The fear of failure, even when all the conditions for success are in your favor. This is the effect of the shadow. The more we deny it, the more it dominates us. But here lies the crucial point of Jung's discovery. Fear is not the enemy. It is a guide. It is trying to show you exactly what you need to face. What you fear says a lot about you, about your wounds, your unresolved pain, your insecurities. But instead of seeing this as a burden, Jung teaches us that it is an opportunity. If you want to free yourself from fear, you need to look inward and begin to understand where it comes from. This, however, is not easy. We were never taught to look at our shadows. On the contrary, we live in a society that encourages us to escape discomfort. When we feel fear, we try to distract ourselves. When we feel anxiety, we seek to avoid it. When something bothers us, we simply pretend it doesn't exist. But this escape has a price. The more we run, the weaker we become. Jung knew that the only way to overcome fear was to face it directly. But this requires something essential: the courage to explore what we have avoided for so long. And here's the most fascinating detail. When you decide to face your shadow, something surprising happens. You realize that what seemed like a monster was, in fact, a part of you asking to be recognized. And instead of fighting fear, you can learn to understand it. Facing fear does not mean eliminating it. Carl Jung never said we should try to erase our insecurities or reject the parts of ourselves that frighten us. On the contrary, he believed that true growth happens when we integrate these parts into our consciousness. This means that instead of running away from what makes us uncomfortable, we need to look directly at it and ask, what is this fear trying to show me? Most people try to silence their fears. When they feel anxiety, they distract themselves with social media, food, or anything else that avoids discomfort. When they feel insecure, they avoid situations that might expose them. But all of this only strengthens the cycle. Jung realized that to free ourselves from fear, we need to do the opposite: bring the shadow into the light of consciousness. This means that instead of avoiding your fears, you need to engage in a dialogue with them. Ask yourself, what exactly am I feeling? Where is this feeling coming from? Is there something in my past that may have created this insecurity? Often the fear we feel today has roots in experiences we don't even consciously remember. A comment made when we were children, a moment of humiliation, a rejection that left a mark. All of this remains stored in our psyche, and if it is not understood, it continues to influence our behavior. Jung discovered that when we face these memories and emotions head-on, something powerful happens. They lose their control over us. What once seemed like an unbearable burden begins to dissolve because we finally make space to understand it. He called this process individuation, the path to psychological wholeness, where all parts of our being are accepted and integrated. But here is the most important point. The shadow is not only made up of fears and traumas. Within it also lie our greatest dormant strengths. Everything we repress is not just negative. It also includes talents we haven't explored, desires we've learned to deny, potential we've never developed. The fear you feel may actually be a sign that something valuable within you is waiting to be discovered. Think about the last time you avoided something out of fear. Maybe it was speaking in public, starting a new project, or expressing your opinion. What exactly held you back? Was it the fear of making a mistake, of being judged, of not being good enough? Now ask yourself, what if this fear is actually an invitation to grow? Jung used to say that what we avoid facing most holds exactly what we need most to become who we truly are. If fear holds within itself an invitation for growth, then running from it means running from our own potential. But transforming this understanding into action requires a fundamental step: the courage to observe ourselves without judgment. For Jung, the journey to true emotional freedom does not begin with the attempt to change who we are, but with the deep recognition of everything we already are, including our insecurities, contradictions, and vulnerabilities. The problem is that we were taught to avoid this kind of self-reflection. We live in a society that encourages us to look only at the surface, to create masks that hide our weaknesses. We show confidence even when we feel insecure. We force smiles even when something is bothering us. We seek external validation while internally feeling that we are never good enough. This disconnection between our appearance and our essence fuels a cycle of fear and anxiety. The more we try to hide who we really are, the more afraid we become of being discovered. Jung realized that the first step to breaking this cycle was learning to observe our own fears without automatically reacting to them. This means that instead of trying to escape an uncomfortable emotion, you should allow it to manifest and ask, what is this feeling trying to tell me? When fear arises, it doesn't come from nowhere. It has an origin. It may be showing you that you are trapped in a limiting belief, or it may be a reflection of something you have avoided for a long time. But what truly changes everything is realizing that you are not your fear. You can feel it, you can hear it, but it does not define who you are. Fear is just a reflection of what your mind believes to be dangerous, and what your mind believes is not always the truth. You have been through situations that, at the time, seemed terrifying, but later turned out to be far less threatening than you imagined. What changed? Only your perspective. Jung taught that the best way to transform our relationship with fear is to bring it into consciousness and integrate it into our identity in a healthy way. This means stopping the fight against it and instead learning from it. If you fear exposing yourself, maybe that means there is a deep desire within you to express yourself more freely. If you fear failure, perhaps it reveals a need to redefine your concept of success. What scares us is not fear itself, but the way we interpret it. Fear can be a blockage or a teacher. The difference lies in what you do with it. But to shift this perspective, you must learn to identify the patterns that keep you trapped in the illusion of fear. And now comes the big question. How can we change this interpretation in practice? How can we reprogram our mind so that fear becomes a guide rather than an enemy? If you truly want to free yourself from fear, you need to start observing what it is trying to teach you. Jung said that what we avoid facing the most contains exactly the answers we are searching for. But transforming this realization into real change requires you to stop reacting to fear as something negative and start seeing it as a compass. Most people deal with fear automatically. When they feel anxiety in the face of an opportunity, they assume it means they shouldn't move forward. When they experience insecurity while trying something new, they conclude that it's not meant for them. But what Jung realized is that fear should not be seen as a stop sign. It should be seen as a pay attention sign. It is a reflection of unresolved parts within us. Whenever you feel an irrational fear, there is a piece of your history that has not yet been fully understood. Imagine you are afraid of failing publicly. You might believe this fear comes from the present, but if you look deeper, you may realize it was born at some point in the past, perhaps when you were criticized as a child, when you felt ashamed of making mistakes, or when you were taught to always seek approval. This means that fear is not speaking about your current reality, but about an unconscious pattern you carry. Here's the most important detail. Fear can only be dissolved when it is understood. And understanding it means identifying its origin, questioning its validity, and consciously deciding what meaning you want to give it. This is the true process of individuation described by Jung, integrating all parts of yourself, including the ones you have avoided for so long. But how do you do that? How do you turn this theory into real practice? The first thing you need to understand is that avoiding fear does not make it disappear. It only hides, waiting for the next opportunity to emerge. If you are afraid of putting yourself out there, it will keep coming back every time a new chance arises to speak in public, express an opinion, or open up emotionally. If you fear failure, it will keep showing up whenever you need to make an important decision. And as long as you keep running, it will keep growing. Fear only loses its power when it is faced directly. But this does not mean confronting it impulsively or forcefully. It means observing fear consciously, without being consumed by it. The next time you feel fear, instead of trying to ignore it or fight it, simply observe it. Ask yourself, what exactly am I feeling? Where might this be coming from? Is this threat real, or is it just a story my mind created? By doing this, you begin to realize that fear is not as powerful as it seems. It is merely a reflection of old patterns that can be rewritten. And as you change the way you interpret fear, it loses its hold over you. But there is one last point that must be understood. Fear never disappears completely, and that is not a problem. Because the goal was never to eliminate it, but to learn how to use it wisely. And that is exactly what differentiates people who live imprisoned by fear from those who learn to transform it into strength. If you've made it this far, you've already realized that fear is not the enemy you always thought it was. It is not here to stop you, but to teach you. And if you learn to listen to it, it can become your greatest ally. But now comes the most important question. How do you turn all of this into real action? How do you stop living as a prisoner of fear and start using it as a guide? Jung discovered that the key to this transformation lies in reinterpreting experience. Fear does not arise out of nowhere. It is a reflection of how you perceive yourself and the world. If you see a situation as threatening, your body responds with fear. But if you change the way you interpret that situation, your emotional response also changes. This means that you do not need to eliminate fear in order to act. You only need to change the meaning you give to it. Instead of seeing anxiety as a sign of weakness, see it as a sign of growth. Instead of seeing insecurity as an obstacle, see it as a call for self-knowledge. Instead of avoiding challenges, face them as opportunities to integrate parts of yourself that you do not yet fully understand. But this transformation does not happen overnight. Jung knew that true change requires practice. You need to start observing your fears consciously, without automatically identifying with them. The next time you feel fear, instead of reacting impulsively, pause for a moment and ask yourself, what exactly am I afraid of? Is this fear coming from a real danger or from a story my mind created? What is this fear trying to show me about myself? And then, instead of running away, take a small step toward it. It doesn't have to be something big. It can be something simple, like expressing an opinion you've always been afraid to share, or taking an action that once seemed intimidating. What matters is that you stop hiding and start acting, even if you still feel fear. Because here's the final secret. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to act despite it. Fear will never completely disappear, but that does not mean it has to control you. The difference between people who live trapped by fear and those who achieve emotional freedom is not the presence or absence of fear. It is what each of them does with it. Jung teaches us that true freedom arises when we stop fighting against who we are and start integrating all parts of our psyche. This means accepting your insecurities without letting them define you. It means facing your shadows without fear, knowing that within them lies immense potential waiting to be discovered. So now, the choice is in your hands. Continue running from fear, or finally face it and transform it into your greatest source of strength. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like. It helps the channel grow and spread this message to more people who need to hear it. And if you want more content on psychology, personal development, and self-awareness, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos.